Hey art nerds, we are back with another figure drawing demonstration. This one is really interesting because, as you'll see in a moment, it includes a reflection. And again, I am using SenshiStock stock. You guys can find a link in the description below. I highly recommend it. So I'm going to begin this pose by drawing in a triangle, and I'm going to use that to help me place the rest of the pose. If you go back and look at the reference, you can see that the pose she's sitting in is a very triangular pose. So I think using this to kind of help establish all of my waypoints is a useful technique. Go ahead and draw in the torso. This one is much more hourglass shaped. We are looking down at the seated person, so I wanted to make sure that I drew the rib cage, the upper portion of the torso, large enough. Now I'm fleshing in another triangle. This is so I can sketch in the reflection. And a pose like this actually requires a fair bit of thought because you want the reflection to line up with the initial pose. That's what makes it look like a reflection. So I am fleshing out the legs like we've talked about in the past. Since the weight is mostly on her hips and her legs, I feel that fleshing them out first gives a sense of gravity. It's also going to allow me to place the reflected figure. And we have an overlapped leg, which I really like because it's something people don't necessarily draw enough of, and I'm glad to have the reference for it. It adds some dynamism and it also adds some reality without increasing the technicality of the pose too much. Now she is looking up at the viewer, and that is something I want to make sure I capture. So I've sketched in the crosshairs across her face. And now, before I flesh her in too much more, I'm going to go ahead and start working on the reflected figure. This is almost like drawing two figures. I mean, you are technically drawing two figures and they are technically interacting. But what's different is that they have to meet up at specific points or it won't look like a reflection. Whereas if we were drawing two figures just interacting and it wasn't a reflection, the points of interaction wouldn't be quite as important as they are in a reflection like this. And I'm not really concerned about capturing the reflection perfectly, but I want to capture it well enough so that it appears like a reflection. So I'm fleshing in the arms. The hands are also overlapped in this pose, which I again like. The more interaction you have, I think the more interesting the pose becomes. And I really like this pose. I'm probably going to reference this again in the future. It's just a nice casual seated pose. It seems like something you might see on the cover of a manga. And I really like the reflection. I think it adds an interesting element to it. So now that I have the pose mostly sketched out, I'm going to zoom in, sharpen my pencil, and start working on the face. So I am using the 3-eye technique. That's going to be a constant in my drawings, whether they're cartoony or realistic. And using the crosshairs to divide the face and define the face allows me to pose the features so that it actually looks like she's looking up at the viewer. And I do this for every drawing I draw, even for doodles, and I find that my success rate is much higher when I do this. It's gotten to the point where it's actually hard for me to draw something without an underdrawing beneath it. So that's actually something I'd like to work on, because when I sign books, I'd love to be able to do a little doodle, but I don't want it to turn into an inky mess, which is where I would be right now. And now I'm going to draw in the face in the reflection. And I'm just kind of, now normally I would completely turn this around so I could get a better angle on it. But since I'm recording, I wanted to make sure that it was easy for you guys to follow. So I'm just kind of lightly sketching it in. It's at the bottom of my sheet of paper anyway, so it's a little harder to capture. Alright, I'm going to call this one done. I didn't do any of the shading, but I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you guys again really soon. Bye, guys!